As I was thinking about introducing Ron and the good Professor Sharkey this evening, I thought about the fact that in my business we're dealing with investments and global geopolitics and taxes and tax reform and how incredibly complex all that is. But all of that pales in comparison to what has gone on over time in the Middle East with respect to the communities of the Jewish community, the Muslim community, and the Christian community. And so I'm very anxious to hear how what the good professor and Ron have to say this evening. So without any further ado, Geopolitics with Ron Granieri.
Thank you, Lee. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Museum of the American Revolution and our friends at the National Liberty Museum. Ladies and gentlemen, it is Tuesday in Philadelphia and the world is as complicated as ever, so let's talk about it. Welcome to the October 2017 edition of Geopolitics with Granieri, FPRI's monthly discussion of international affairs. I'm Ron Granieri, Executive Director of FPRI's Center for the Study of America and the West, your host and moderator of today's discussion. All of us at FPRI thank you for joining us today, live and archived on the internet, and live this evening on October 10th, 2017 at the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia. It is a pleasure to have you with us. The world's three great monotheistic religions not only trace their origins to the same region of the world, they each continue to view the region as part of their individual sacred inheritances. Precisely because they share so much, they have often found it difficult to manage the practical terms of sharing. It's not just a matter of political power and group rights, though such questions are complex enough. It's a matter of deciding how much commonality to admit while maintaining distinct identities, how much variety to permit without undermining peace and stability. For most of the modern era, those holy regions and those communities have been governed under the sometimes leaky umbrella of the Ottoman Empire. As the descendants of the fierce warriors who drove out the last vestiges of the Crusaders, the Ottomans dominated the region for 5 centuries. The empire went through periods of weakness, rebellion, and reform, and attempted to manage its diverse realm by the use of a loose system of self-governing religious communities. It was not based on legal equality, but by granting those communities a degree of legal protection within a hierarchy of privileges and responsibilities. Negotiating that hierarchy within a society in which non-Muslim dhimmi, protected persons, did not enjoy full legal equality was never a simple task, and one does well not to romanticize the multicultural successes of the Ottomans. But the story of how Ottoman authorities wrestled with the legal, political, and cultural complexities of these multiple communities is worth exploring for anyone who wants to understand the legacies that continue to shape the region. Our guest this evening, Dr. Heather Sharkey, has recently published a deeply researched historical analysis of the interrelationship between Muslims, Christians, and Jews in the Middle East, especially in the Ottoman realms during the modern period up to the eve of the First World War, the culture which destroyed the Ottoman Empire for good. The title of the book, of course, is A History of Muslims, Christians, and Jews in the Middle East. So what you see is what you get. Combining broad historical sweep with creative and detailed discussions of the practices of everyday life, Professor Sharkey helps us to understand not only what the political leaders of the empire and their official representatives tried to do, but also how the subjects of the empire lived the experience of those legal frameworks. For at one time or another, everything from headwear to footwear was the subject of administrative management. Always present was the issue of religious identity, though not always in ways one might expect. One of Professor Sharkey's most intriguing insights is contained in one clever turn of phrase. Quote, "Perhaps it is more useful to ask, how was religion important, as opposed to how important was religion?" Many questions arise from this analysis that are as old as time and as new as this evening's headlines. How should states respect religious pluralism but encourage communal harmony? What should citizens of different faiths expect from each other, from the state? Will the children of Abraham ever live together in peace in the land of their common origin? These questions, and yours, will guide us in conversation tonight with our guest, Dr. Heather Sharkey. Dr. Heather Sharkey is professor in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at the University of Pennsylvania. After earning a BA in anthropology, summa cum laude and Phi Beta Kappa from Yale, she earned an MPhil in modern Middle Eastern studies from the University of Durham as a Marshall Scholar and a Ph.D. in history at Princeton. A member of the Penn faculty since 2002, where she won the 2011 Charles Ludwig Distinguished Teaching Award from the School of Arts and Sciences. She has also taught at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and Trinity College in Connecticut. And along the way was also a visiting professor in Paris at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales and in the Institut d'études d'Islam et des Sociétés du Monde Musulman. And I'm not going to say that again. In addition to a history of Muslims, Christians, and Jews in the Middle East, Dr. Sharkey is the author of Living with Colonialism, Nationalism, and Culture in the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan and American Evangelicals in Egypt, Missionary Encounters in an Age of Empire. She is also the co-editor with Mehmet Ali Dogan of American Missionaries and the Middle East, Foundational Encounters, and is the editor of Cultural Conversions, Unexpected Consequences of Christian Missions in the Middle East, Africa, and South Asia, as well as a range of other scholarly studies too. A leading scholar of one of the world's most fascinating and complex regions, and a brilliant representative of the kind of academic research work being done right here in Philadelphia. We are delighted to have her with us tonight. Welcome, Dr. Heather Sharkey.
Thanks, John.
So, Heather, I want to start with a question related to the quote of yours that I pulled out of the book.
Okay.
What do you think about, or in what ways does your research show the specific influence of religious faith in the shaping of relationships between communities in the Middle East?
Okay. Before I answer that,
Please do.
I just want to start by saying how thrilled I am to be here. So thank you very much. And it's really a privilege to be in this place in particular. But you asked a question about religious faith. And one of the
Yes.
things I argue is that we shouldn't understand religion in the Middle East as only a matter of faith, suggesting interior belief, that religion was a legal status.
Yes.
So according to Islamic states, whether you were Muslim, Christian, or Jewish, affected things such as, the person you could marry or how you would inherit. And then they ended up enacting policies as well. So we really have to be careful about how we use the term religion.
Then what about, so religion as lived experience and identity rather than as an internal effort? I guess the question is how did the Ottoman Empire identify people's membership in one or another community?
So really, the assumption was that people were born carrying the religion of their fathers, and that determined their legal status, which affected things like, again, marriage and inheritance and so on. It had some professional consequences, so non-Muslims could not serve in the military and so on. They could not be the rulers of the state and so forth. But aside from that, the Ottoman state, like earlier Islamic states, assumed that religious communities would be able to manage their internal affairs. And so except in cases where there was friction between Muslims and non-Muslims. And so the state expected, for example, Christians and Jews to liaise with each other internally and provide taxes to the state. But what's important to note is that for most of Islamic history, and this applied to the Ottoman period as well, the Ottoman state actually didn't care that much about what people did within their communities. So the Ottoman state didn't care how Christians practiced their Christianity or how Jews practiced their Judaism. And in fact, it didn't care that much about how Muslims practiced their Islam either. And the result was that in practice, there was a tremendous amount of diversity in religious life.
See, I find this is very interesting, right? So the Ottoman state isn't interested in how you define yourself as a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim. However, Christian, Jewish, and Muslim authorities are intensely interested in how members of their communities identify themselves. I mean, I think about this with regard to Christians' debates between Orthodox and Catholic and later on Protestants. I doubt there were many in the Ottoman Empire, but certainly
There were some by the
right?
late 19th century.
And so when disagreements emerged within those communities, did the Ottoman state take any interest in the name of simply political harmony in trying to resolve them?
Occasionally they did, and the Ottoman state was aware in particular of tensions among Christians. Jews tended to show a more united front in spite of the diversity within their ranks, but partly because the Jewish populations were so tiny. And so they did a better job at maintaining an image of communal cohesion when they projected to the outside world. But Christians were were divided along theological lines, doctrinal lines, from the very beginning of the Islamic era in the 7th century.
Sure.
And one consequence of that was that the Islamic states, including and then especially the Ottoman state, never treated Christians as a monolithic group. And they recognized two major divisions in particular, and these were the Greek Orthodox Christians and the Armenian Christians. And then what started to happen beginning in the 17th century, continuing in the 18th, and intensifying in the 19th, European Catholic and Protestant missions started to come in. They started to encourage the formation of new schismatic churches, and the Ottomans came under pressure to recognize more Christian groups. And so one of the ways that the Ottomans handled Christians was by allowing them to divide and not to have to cooperate.
So did, when I think about this, sort of the Greek Orthodox or Armenian Christian churches, they did not appeal to Constantinople to say, can't you drive out these schismatics who are undermining our position? Or did the Ottoman state simply decided that wasn't their business?
Well, a number of things started to happen. I mean, by the 17th century, Catholic group, Europe is growing. Certain European powers are growing more powerful. France, especially, is growing very powerful and representing Catholic interests. So as the Ottomans started to lose power, they tried to appease France. And one of the ways they did this was by recognizing French Catholic claims to the autonomy of different Christian communities. And in fact, and the Christians were very upset about what was going on, but usually, in fact, one of the issues in Islamic history is that Muslims did not intervene in internal Christian disputes. And arguably, that also contributed to the proliferation of differences within Christian communities, to the extent that some observers say that the Ottomans encouraged divisions among Christians as a mode of divide and rule. It wasn't to the disadvantage of the Ottoman Empire to see Christians becoming divided.
I can imagine. But what about divisions within Islam?
That was one of the big surprises of the book as I was writing it. And getting especially into the late 19th century. What happened was, for centuries, Islamic states didn't really bother too much with what Muslims were doing. And there were religious scholars in the major cities who left treatises saying what Islamic law was or should be and what Islam was. But really, for ordinary people, ordinary Muslims in cities and villages, they were practicing what we might now call, a kind of syncretic religions. Right. And some of them were blending elements of Islam and Christianity or Islam and Judaism and so on. So the Ottoman state was okay with that, but the situation started to change in the 19th century for a couple of reasons. One is that the Ottoman state began to be worried about the ability of Christian missionaries to convert groups that were ambiguously Muslim. So there was one group that was a sort of a hybrid Jewish Muslim community. There was another group, the Alawites of Syria, associated with the Assad family, who other Muslims regarded as practicing a kind of sketchy Islam. There were a group called the Alevis in what's now Turkey, who practiced an Islam which had very strong Shiite overtones. And Christian missionaries thought they might be able to convert these groups. The Ottoman state thought so too. And they started, therefore, to get worried about Muslim groups that weren't appropriately Muslim. And so starting in the late 19th century, the Ottoman state started to send out basically Muslim missionaries to rectify the Islam of the Muslims in their territories. And one of the other causes of concern was that Iran was sending many Shi'i Muslim clerics into what is now Iraq, and more Muslims, it appeared, were starting to shift consciously towards what we would now call Shi'ism. So in fact, and one of the amazing things, and something we have to recognize that comes out of this story, is that although Islamic states like to pretend or imagined that Muslims represented a unified community, there were many divisions within them. And the tensions inherent, or present within the Muslim community became sharper in the 19th century.
Well, and I'm glad you brought up this. The 19th century is an era of increasing secularization, nationalism within Europe, so among the Ottoman Empire's neighbors. And the question of how, if at all, did the Ottoman Empire begin to see itself less as a Muslim empire and more as an Ottoman or even a Turkish operation?
They always saw, the Ottoman rulers always saw their empire Islamic because Islam justified their existence. They had to retain, like Muslim politicians today, claims to representing and preserving Islam, or they would lose their political legitimacy. But it turns out that there were some intellectuals, especially in cities like Istanbul and Cairo, who began to find the French revolutionary principles very appealing, ideas of liberty and equality and so on. And some of those very progressive thinkers started to say, well, maybe we could reform things and sort of try to create notions of citizenship that would bind us together and help to overcome the divisions that are becoming more manifest. And actually, it's a study of those divisions that is a large part of the book.
Well, see, and that's what I found so interesting about the book, right? Is this tension between there are reasons why the central government of the empire would like to encourage a kind of identity that links everybody across all communities. And one could imagine that if there had been a sort of Ottoman patriotism or a sense of Ottoman identity, that this would have strengthened the empire, because they had to deal both with the differences between these communities and also the difference between local rulers, even local Muslim rulers. I think about in Egypt, and
right.
That were pulling away from Constantinople.
And Christian populations were much larger in the Ottoman Empire than Jewish populations. The Jewish populations tended to be in cities like, say, Cairo or Aleppo in Syria, and they were there. But the Christians were especially in rural areas, there were substantial populations. And among the Christian populations, ideas of nationalism started to take hold. Yeah. And the Ottoman Empire began to worry about that, especially after the 1820s, when Greek nationalists staged a revolt and demanded independence. And it became a real concern. And so there were some Ottoman statesmen who thought, wow, if we sort of embrace some of these French revolutionary ideas of citizenship, we can overcome these divisions and unify our empire. The problem was, or part of the problem was, that you had these, very progressive intellectuals at the center of the empire, but the rank and file Muslim population did not necessarily agree with this. Or actually, no, did not agree with this.
Just did not, yeah.
And one of the major arguments, I would say, of the book is that there were deep-rooted cultural assumptions based on centuries of Islamic statecraft, premised on the idea that Muslims occupied a superior position in society relative to Christians and Jews who should remain subordinate. So for many Muslims bought into these assumptions of these hierarchies, which should be there as part of a timeless or traditional Islamic order. And many of those rank and file people were objected to these efforts to equalize or to promote egalitarian ideas in the 19th century.
Yeah. See, because you take the formal story of your research goes up until the years before the First World War, the Young Turks rebellion in Turkey. But how would you describe where the Ottoman Empire was, and in its sense of its identity and politics and the relationship between the communities on the eve of the First World War?
Well, so there was a growing sense of what we would now call Turkish nationalism, starting to emerge in the late 19th century. So among Muslims in the empire, there was starting to be a tension between a kind of incipient Turkish nationalism and Arab nationalism, where some Arabic speakers are thinking, hey, wait a minute, this is sort of starting to get too Turkish to be included, to include us. And so there started to be doubts in that way. At the same time, some of the military leaders within the Ottoman Empire were becoming very attracted to certain European ideas, including some that we would call or put under the framework of secular ideas. And they were using a rhetoric of brotherhood, a very gendered rhetoric of brotherhood, not sisterhood, and egalitarianism. And scholars argue that Jews in particular began to identify with this kind, Jews especially in what's now Turkey, began, and in places like Jerusalem and elsewhere, Jewish intellectuals began to identify with this kind of late Ottoman identity and to think, yeah, we can be part of this. We want to be part of this Ottoman nation. For many Christians, it was still not so clear that that was going to work. And it may have had something to do with the fact that, the Jewish communities were so small. They had historically been very loyal to the Ottoman state, and they identified very closely with it.
In the sense that, so were Christians struggling with the sense of having been conquered by the Ottomans in a way that that Jews who had found the empire a refuge from Christian persecution saw the empire as a protector?
There may have been that, but there was also the fact, especially with regard to the Armenians, right, that among Armenians, there were large Armenian populations in what is now eastern Turkey. And they were outside, they were away from the big cities. And they were, in the countryside and medium and small towns, they were finding themselves being subjected to attacks, especially by Kurdish and Turkish poor, rural, some of them were pastoralists and rural dwellers. They were feeling arguably the sting of their social subordination as Christians more than urban dwellers were, whether they were Jewish or Armenian urban dwellers, like in Istanbul.
Right.
And so I think that some of the Christian thinkers in the late Ottoman Empire, especially again in what is now Eastern Turkey, they were not really identifying with this program.
Interesting. I have a big question that I want to
Okay.
ask, because I think this to lead on to some other big questions. But when compared to the violence and the ethnic cleansing of the contemporary Middle East, some observers look back on the multicultural Ottoman
Yes.
period as a golden age.
Yeah.
But was it? I mean, and I got to ask this: is cohabitation based on creating specific groups with different legal status? Is that really tolerance, or is it just the best we can do?
Okay, that's a great question, and there are different parts, and I'll try to tackle it in different
Take them
ways.
as many ways as you
Okay,
want.
so one thing is that when many people in the Middle East or outside the Middle East look back on the Ottoman period, the reason it might look like a golden age is because there were very diverse populations, including many Jewish and Christian populations. So it's really culturally vibrant. And then they're all, now they're all gone. And you look at a country like Turkey, which is 99.6% Muslim, and the Armenians are basically gone, and the Jews are mostly gone, except for something like 24,000. And you look at many other countries, Libya, no Jews left at all in Libya, Egypt, and so on. So people are now looking back and thinking, wow, in the Ottoman Empire, there was this period when all these people lived together, and look how wonderful it was. So there's this kind of sense of nostalgia out of a sense of loss, right? At the same time, we should remember that empires are not voluntary formations. They arise out of coercion. And the Ottoman Empire was no exception to this pattern, and it included groups that its forebears had conquered. And when they conquered the populations, they raided them in the beginning, and then they forced them to pay taxes and extra taxes for non-Muslims. And especially in rural areas, Christian communities tended to be subject to more raiding without supervision from state authorities. So there were many aspects to it that were not pretty, and they were not voluntary. Now, in Turkey itself today, there's currently a kind of nostalgia industry for the Ottoman past. There was this soap opera that attracted a lot of attention a few years back called The Magnificent Century. If you watch a little bit of it on YouTube, you can see why Turks love it. It's really captivating, and it takes place at the peak of the Ottoman Empire.
So would that century be the 17th century?
No,
is it-
16th century, the
Oh,
reign
okay.
of Suleiman the Magnificent. And Erdogan in Turkey today is trying to, claim this kind of Turkish, this Ottoman glory as a way, I would argue in his case, of asserting a kind of expansive power for Turkey, a kind of justification for influence over the territories that the Ottoman Empire once controlled.
And so that leads into that other question that I was thinking of is, how the Turks for various reasons have a sort of positive, nostalgic view of the empire. But what about the Arab states of the Middle East, the other states of the Middle East that are Muslim and might have some pride in the fact that the Ottoman Empire was once this great expansive power, but they don't have the same direct connection to the Ottoman Turkish state or Ottoman Turkish community?
So, I mean, back in the 1980s, 70s, 80s, and you would read histories of the Ottoman past written by Egyptians, for example, and they would describe the Turks as oppressors. Maybe that's changed a little bit, but not because of a glorification of the Ottoman Empire in particular, or Turkey's claims to representing it. But there is, I think, throughout many parts of the Middle East, a sense of loss and nostalgia. I was in Cairo 2 weeks ago giving a lecture at the French one of the French research institutes there. And it's very clear, for example, that right now in Egypt, there's a strong interest in the Jewish communities. There's a kind of a concern about, and I was told, somebody told me that many Muslims are now starting to take Coptic language classes. So at least among certain sectors of the population, I think there is an awareness of a sense of loss, of a diversity that's under threat. So obviously that's not the whole population, but there is a nostalgia, which I would not call an Ottoman nostalgia, but a nostalgia for the past and an awareness of what many of the countries in the region have lost.
Interesting. On our way over here, we were talking about how we got started in this profession, right?
Yeah.
And that your initial work was about Egypt and about Africa and
Sudan.
And the Sudan. So how does one get from there to this?
So it was very simple, really. What happened was, when I came to Penn in 2002, my department asked me if I would be the academic advisor for the undergraduates in the Arabic and Hebrew section of our major. We have Arabic Islamic Studies, Hebrew and Judaica, Egyptology, and Ancient Near East, which is like Sumerian, Assyriology. And they had one section and they needed an advisor. And so I agreed to be the advisor, and I had many students coming to me who, many of them had gone to Jewish schools and were starting to study Arabic. They studied a lot of Hebrew before. I had a few students that came from Arab backgrounds that wanted to study Hebrew. And as a result of dealing with this community of students in particular, I became aware of Jewish-Muslim dialogue initiatives on the Penn campus. And because of my background in Sudanese and Egyptian history, I had an awareness, especially with regard to Sudan, of the historical dynamics of Muslim-Christian relations. And I decided to offer a course at Penn to bring these areas together and to respond to the interest that I was seeing among my students. So I started by teaching a seminar, and then I was telling Ron, a publisher from Cambridge University Press, saw that I was teaching the class and asked me to write the book. And so the rest is history, as they say. Yeah.
So when are you offering the seminar again?
I'm teaching it now.
Teaching it now. Oh, how interesting!
Yeah.
Right. So does everybody get to see the
Yeah.
you get to see the book?
Yeah, it's really
don't read this because you'll know everything I'm going to bring up.
Yeah. Or we also read other things, and I am having them look at it, and it is sort of funny to be doing that. But yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
that's actually fun. You know, I had a professor who, when he assigned his own book, he either would put on the syllabus that he was donating his proceeds, but also there was a story of one professor who came to the class the first day with a series of $1 bills and handed one to every student and said, "This, in case you buy my book, I'm giving you back my royalties."
Actually, you know, when I was at Princeton in graduate school in the Ph.D. program for history, the Princeton history department had a policy that they would not assign their own books. And so I felt uncomfortable about doing that. So the way I did it was I asked the library to get an ebook so that the students wouldn't have to buy my book.
That's a level of community responsibility that's truly admirable. Well, I want to ask you about, to be a historian of the Middle East, or to be a historian in a Near Eastern languages and cultures program, means you get asked a lot of questions, not just about the specific periods that you research, but about their relevance and their connection to what's going on today.
Yes.
I'm not going to ask you to opine in great detail about the about current events. I'll leave that to the audience. But I did want to ask you, how do you see the connection between what historians do and contemporary affairs? Like even if the particular thing that you're studying is not current current affairs, but if there is a relationship to it, what should the role of scholars be in our discussions of world events?
The role of scholars should be creating empathy and enabling people to talk about the past in ways that help us to create a better future.
Wow, that's pretty good. I should have saved that question for the end of the program.
No, I mean, the thing is this. At Penn, I have very diverse classes. As you know, I have students from all over the world. So how can we talk about a history that many might find sensitive or even painful? How can we talk about it in a meaningful way? And so when I was writing the book, I'm thinking about the community of students that I have, and in all their diversity, in trying to find ways of coming to grips with the past and making sense of it, and thinking about what we're going to do in our society now.
These are very good questions. I'm going to ask one more while the audience warms up for their questions. If you in the audience, if you have a question, please raise your hand. Someone will hand you a microphone. And the first question goes always to someone who has never been to Geopolitics with Granieri before. So if you are new to the program, you get to ask the first question. I see a hand up right there in the back of the room. Yes, actually, we'll go right to that question. There's the microphone. Take the microphone, please. Make sure you speak into it for the recording. Yeah.
I'm curious about what you said about the Christians and the Jews and the Muslims in the Ottoman Empire. Did the Ottoman Empire do the same thing as they did in early Russia, where they had the Jewish people go out and be the collectors, and then from the other people, and then pay the government? Were they given that job? Did that contribute to different stratospheres?
The policies varied within the Ottoman Empire. Usually what the Ottoman authorities did was they would have people collect taxes within the community. So they would have Christian tax collectors in some areas collecting among Christians and Jews collecting among Jews, although not everywhere. I mean, there was actually no uniform policy. So in some of the rural areas, they would have Muslim officials in the town collecting the money and so on. So there was no unified policy.
Interesting. Question right here, Rachel. Please remember to keep the microphone close. Go ahead.
Yes. So two questions, both relating to the Millet system. At what was the break point at which the empire would concede the emergence of a new Millet, where they would recognize a Shia sect or a Christian church?
They never recognized a Shia sect until the very end of the empire. The Ottoman Empire never recognized internal divisions among Muslims.
Among Muslims? That's
Yeah,
interesting.
never.
Oh.
They worked on the assumption, partly because it was tied to the legitimacy of the state, that Muslims were one group. And so they kind of ignored the divisions. And even in the period after they started to enact policies to try to rectify Muslim groups that they considered deviant. But among the Christians, it was really when there was intense lobbying, or when Christian groups gave them some money to win their recognition, like lobbying and bribery.
Money.
But there was no minimum number that you had to be so big.
No, not minimum number.
So second question. I'm interested in what were the lateral relations like among the Millets, and was it ad hoc, or was it formalized, and was there ever any sort of an overarching council where the Millets would meet collectively or consult?
So the Millets referring to the religious communities that the Ottoman authorities recognized. There was no overarching assembly of the various groups. And to what extent did they encourage people to contact each other? Not that much. Although one thing historians do note is that Christians and Jews always had the option of seeking judgments in legal cases from Islamic Sharia courts. So frequently, Christian and Jewish women would opt to use the Islamic courts because they were more liberal, especially in matters of divorce. And Islamic courts were ready to give women, for example, unilateral divorce in cases of abandonment or egregious abuse and so on. So in general, that was one of the sore points, that there was always that escape hatch that the non-Muslims could seek Islamic justice.
Let's go right here first. Yeah, first here.
So,
Yep.
just before the Armenian genocide, there was this nationalism among the Turks. But I wonder, was there anything that the Armenian Christians and the Greek Christians, I had heard that at least in the eastern Turkey, that they wanted to assert their independence and have an independent state. And then, of course, the Turks could use that as an excuse for their genocide. Is there any truth to that?
They did want autonomy and more rights, and it was partly in response to the increase of raiding, especially with the Armenians, the increase of raiding in eastern Anatolia at the end of the 19th century. And it's not clear whether the amount of raiding that there was in the late 19th century was the amount there had always been, or if there was an intensification of raiding. But what's happening was that there were many Christian missionary schools, including many missionary schools in the East. And Armenians were becoming very well educated, almost universal literacy among men and women. Some were starting to emigrate to the United States. And partly as a result of their experiences of living in the United States, free from some of the harassment and troubles that they were facing, and sending remittances or coming back, and partly as a result of their growing confidence because they were becoming better educated, they started to demand better conditions. So not all of them wanted to break off. There were certain groups that did, but some of them definitely were agitating for greater autonomy and protection.
Interesting. Let's go right over here.
Okay. I was interested in your experience at Penn with your students that come from the Middle East, the Arabs, the Jews, the Christians. My experience is that I also was interested in your term empathy that you showed, because my experience is that it's exceedingly difficult, increasingly, for young people or students from these parts of the world to really dialogue and communicate. And I was wondering what your experience is with that.
Well, I try to create a safe and comfortable space inside classrooms where students can speak respectfully to each other about sensitive issues. We had a conversation this afternoon in one of my classes about, current contemporary Israeli policies in the West Bank. And it became sensitive, but the students felt really relieved that they were able to talk. And so I think it was if you engage in respectful discussion and you allow people to express a variety of views, then people are more willing to build friendships and alliances, and that helps to make the world a better place because people can see each other's point of view. It's as simple as that. But I have lots of very diverse students, including many who, by the way, who come from hybrid family backgrounds, mixed marriages of different kinds. So it's really, we have a tremendous diversity among the students.
Sure. Right here.
The Industrial Revolution had a very disruptive and positive impact in Europe. Did the Industrial Revolution have any or much impact in the Ottoman Empire, and did that affect relationships among the various religious groups?
And actually, to piggyback on that, you talk about urban life.
Yeah.
And so what did industrialization, urbanization, right? What kinds of impacts did that have on life in the Ottoman Empire for these different communities?
Yeah, I mean, there is some evidence that the influx of European manufactured goods dealt a blow at some of the urban artisanal communities and created a sense of malaise among what we might call working class sectors of the Muslim population. And there were, among some of those communities, the resistance to the reforms of the 19th century were sharpest. So a lot of we could see a strong class dynamic to the history in this period, which gets grafted onto religious issues.
Interesting. Right here.
You mentioned an interest in Egypt in the Jewish community. How is that, a couple questions related to that, how is that interest developing or manifesting itself? And number two, how is it possible in an environment where there seems to be such hostility toward Israel and Jews in general?
I think what's happening and it's obviously not uniform throughout Egyptian society, but I think right now in Egypt, based on my visit there are many segments of the Muslim population who are feeling a little bit beleaguered and even besieged by the growth of certain Islamist movements within the country. So I think among Muslims there are also tensions. And among the more socially liberal Muslims there are concerns about the past of religious communities that weren't Muslim and that struggled with issues of inclusion before. So I think partly because of the internal tensions in Egyptian society right now, that's part of the reason why there is this interest. I'll give you an example of where I encountered this. I went to the American University in Cairo, which was founded by Americans from Philadelphia, opened in 1920. And they moved about 10 years ago to a desert campus outside of, they used to be in Tahrir Square in central Cairo, and they moved out to a desert campus. And I went out there, and I told the professor I was coming, and he actually invited me to speak. He was teaching a class on the history of Zionism. And he said, it would be great if you could speak to us about the history of Middle Eastern Jews, because our class on Zionism only focuses on Europe. I was like, wow, wow. So I was like, okay, I'll do my best. So I went, and there was an extremely eager and engaged group of about 40 students at an 8:30 a.m. class. So that shows dedication.
Golly.
And they were so eager to hear about the subject. And afterwards they said, are you staying here? I wish you'd tell us more. You know, one of the students came up to me and said, you know, it's forbidden for us to study this, and the textbooks in the government schools did not include any mention of that, but it's when we see old Egyptian movies, sometimes we'll see the actresses had Stars of David, we realize that there were Jews in Egypt, and but we don't know anything about them. So I think among some of the young people in the educated sectors, there's a sense that they haven't been told the full story. Right. And so there's a sense of curiosity, which may coexist with anti-Israeli sentiments at the same time, of course, but there is an interest in knowing more.
Which is always a positive thing. Right here, please.
I have a comment and a question. My comment is I was trolling over YouTube about 6 months ago, and I found an interesting lecture, it's about an hour and a quarter, called 1178 BC. And the professor talked about what the situation was in the Middle East. And he said Greece was bankrupt, Lebanon and Palestine was warring between the Hittites and the Egyptians. Warlords were kind of ruling over all the areas of Syria. And he says, things haven't changed very much, but you've put a veneer of religion across this, but I wonder if it's more culturally deep. And religion is just one aspect that we look at now. My question is, what was the impact of the Crimean War on the split up, when the pressures put on religion?
I realize the Crimean War comes right in the middle of a period of attempted reform within the empire.
Yeah, so the Crimean War is interesting because the French and the Russians used the pretext of a dispute over who controlled the keys to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem as something that, sparked the war. And afterwards, the Ottoman authorities, having relied so heavily on British aid, found themselves in a position where they felt like they had to make reforms that pleased the British as coming out of this war. And so one of the major consequence was that the Ottoman Sultan issued an edict in 1856 which proclaimed the idea of religious liberty. And so one of the questions that I debate in the book is, to what extent did the Sultan really intend to proclaim religious liberty? What did that mean? Did it have any impact on the ground? Or was it just something that he did in the aftermath of the Crimean War because of this need to satisfy the great powers? So that's where I see that war coming in most significantly in this story.
Interesting.
It did, but because of the ambiguous impact of some of these Ottoman reforms that followed from that.
Interesting. Good. Yes.
Thank you very much. I'm very fascinated by what your experience in Egypt. I was born in Egypt, so as a Jew, knowing the different groups there. Of course, you're familiar with that, with all the students at the university, of course. You mentioned nostalgia. I was wondering if you're talking about nostalgia for the Ottoman Empire or nostalgia of the period when the British and the French were there, when they came and they abolished all these dhimmi's laws, and therefore people were more equal, and the Jews prospered, as you know very well in Egypt, in the beginning of the 20th century. And therefore these students that you encounter at the American University in Cairo, are they nostalgic about that period, or are they nostalgic about the period of the Ottoman Empire?
I don't think they're nostalgic about the Ottoman Empire in
Thank you.
Egypt. But what's
Yeah.
interesting that they are, I heard something remarkable, not only at the American University in Cairo. I was at the French Research Institute, so I was speaking to, the French government has this beautiful research institute in the heart of Cairo, which goes back to the 1880s. It's gorgeous. And I was speaking to people there, and some of them said something amazing to me. They expressed a nostalgia for the Egyptian monarchy. That was the first time I heard that. So you said nostalgia for the British and French influence, but nostalgia for King Farouk? I was surprised. That was the first time I heard that. I think people are nostalgic for the pre-1952 period. And there's actually been a kind of a souring within Egypt towards Gamal Abdel Nasser and the whole free officers movement and the whole package of what happened in the 1950s and 60s.
It's an interesting reminder that no matter what period you're living in can always be somebody's good old days.
Exactly.
I'm gonna let that sink in the audience right now. Let's see. I think we had one more question right here in the front.
I'm touched by your interest in your students and your desire to facilitate communication, which I assume comes from your training as an anthropologist. But in the back of my mind is a quote from Goethe to the effect, who was not much of a multiculturalist, that he saw the world, the possibility of the world becoming one huge hospital in which everyone is everybody else's nurse. This is a darker story, really, than you're painting it. I mean, there are real hatreds. There's a real hierarchy of belief among the peoples of the Middle East as to who is better than the other. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that that we really haven't heard about that in the presentation you've made tonight.
Well, I think that element of darkness is in the book. It may not have come out yet, but one thing where I will agree with you completely is that there are assumptions which we can see in the present day as well, assumptions of a Muslim-dominated social order, which go back centuries. And it was the Ottoman state that was trying to maintain that system, and there are definitely strong impulses that way today as well. This assumption that in territories ruled by Muslims, that Islam and Muslim values dominate.
Thank you.
And the other thing I would add is that, I said that there were, what we could consider benign aspects of this story, like, I mentioned, or quirky aspects, like Jewish and Christian women going to seek a more liberal divorce ruling from an Islamic court. But I'm not denying, when you are a non-Muslim and the state expects you to pay extra taxes as a sign of your subordination, and when Islamic laws don't let Muslim men marry Christian and Jewish women, but don't let Christian and Jewish men marry Muslim women, these are systems of domination that rankle. Mm-hmm. And in circumstances like this, when you have these social hierarchies, and yet people are learning about ideas of republicanism and equality and fraternity and sorority and so forth, these ideas aren't going to work. So the Islamic political order may have worked reasonably well over many centuries, but I wouldn't want to be living in one today.
I'm afraid we're going to have to end on that note, although on that note of an honest assessment of the complexity of the history that we've been discussing. I'm afraid that's all the time we have for this conversation. I want to thank Dr. Heather Sharkey for joining us tonight. And I want to remind all of you that while tonight's conversation is over, the conversation continues at FPRI. The conversation will continue in Geopolitics with Granieri every month. I hope that tonight I want to thank, in addition to Heather Sharkey, I want to thank the Museum of the American Revolution. I want to thank our friends at the National Liberty Museum. I want to thank the BNY Mellon Wealth Management and the Lyndon Harry Bradley Foundation for the support of this program. And I hope that if those of you, if you want to keep up with future events of episodes of Geopolitics with Granieri or other events at FPRI, to please visit our website, fpri.org, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and subscribe to our iTunes channels and YouTube channels. You can follow the host of this program on Twitter at Ronald Granieri. I hope to see many of you again. If you enjoyed what you heard tonight, if you found it worthwhile, please tell a friend and bring a friend next time. I will also note there are copies of the book are available for sale on your way out. Until next time on Geopolitics with Granieri, for all of us at FPRI, for my colleagues Rachel Hemler, Alan Luxemburg, I'm Ron Granieri. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.